Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Colorado Energy Office today and for participating in this public engagement meeting. I know it's 3:02, but we're just going to wait another minute and wait for some other people to join and make sure that our live stream is up and working. So we're going to wait a minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Colorado Energy Office today and talking about the state's building performance standard policy. We're going to get started here and more people will join as they can. Thank you again for your participation in this meeting. For a quick round of introductions, I'm Crystal Egelkamp. I'm the Benchmarking and Building Performance Standards Program Manager here at the Energy Office. I'm joined by Keith Hay, who is our Director of Policy and also helps manage this program. We also are joined by Lotus Sustainability. We have Claire and we have Kimberly on the line as well, and they help facilitate our Building Performance Standards Task Force, and as well as meetings like this. So we're very glad to have their help and support here. Just a few housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. It will be on our website after this meeting, and Keith, you can go to the next slide. We also will be saving questions for the end of each section. We have a lot of information to talk to you about today when it comes to this policy. So we will pause for questions and we will ask people to either unmute themselves or to use Zoom's hand raise function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom bar and should allow you to raise your hand. You can go to the next slide, Keith. Also, if you could please change your Zoom name to your full name and your organization so we can know who is joining us on this call today. And also, if you could please remain muted until we call on you to ask a question. Feel free to turn your cameras on or to keep them off. We're very happy to have you here participating. And then moving on to our agenda. We will give everyone a bit of background on this policy and how it came to be and how this policy passed. We'll also give an overview of the building performance standard policy so far and what the task force has come up with, and then we'll delve more into the detailed recommendations after that. Then we'll wrap things up and talk about next steps with this policy as well as the next steps for our task force. And also feel free to put questions in the chat as well as we're going along. We can also ask those questions at our set question time. So moving on to our background, as some of you may be aware, the Colorado state has a greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap that identified many actions the state could take to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the whole state. There are a few actions that were identified for the building sector. These actions included building benchmarking and building performance standards. And so as a result of this roadmap, the Energy Performance for Building Statute, or House Bill 21-1286 as we refer to it, this established the sector-wide building benchmarking and performance standards. The goal of this legislation is simply to help building owners increase their energy efficiency and lower their energy costs, as well as to help the state decrease greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector. And moving on to the next slide, Keith. This legislation, the House Bill 21-1286, directed the Energy Office to develop a statewide benchmarking program, which is now referred to as Building Performance Colorado. A few of you on this call may receive notices from us or have begun to hear about this program, which I hope you have. But essentially, this program requires commercial, multifamily, and public buildings 50,000 square feet or larger to report their annual energy usage to the Energy Office. And if you're not familiar, benchmarking is just simply the process of tracking a building's energy usage through its utility data. And this will include electricity and gas usage data. And it's a very great policy which allows building owners to understand their building's energy use and to understand how their building compares to other buildings or similar property types. For this program, building owners are required to submit their energy data through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is a free tool created by the EPA. And this is a very common benchmarking tool used across other states and cities. This data is due to the Energy Office December 1st of this year, and then June 1st of every subsequent year. To find out more about our benchmarking program, you can go to the link on this presentation. This presentation is on our website already, so you can find the links there, or you can find the link in the chat to find more information about the details around the benchmarking compliance. However, today we will focus more on the building performance standard. So moving on to the next slide. So House Bill 21-1286 established the statewide benchmarking program, but it also established a building sector-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets of 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. These greenhouse gas reduction targets are from a 2021 baseline, and that has been directed in the statute. So this is not a baseline that we can change, unfortunately. All of these reductions and energy usage reductions have to be made from a 2021 baseline. And so as you can see, the state's benchmarking program, it started this year. So we are currently collecting this 2021 baseline data, and it's very important for our building performance standards policy. And so essentially, building owners will need to meet certain building performance standard targets by 2026 and 2030. And if you're not familiar with building performance standards, the way I like to explain them is that it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Benchmarking comes first. It helps building owners as well as city and state officials understand what the energy usage is in buildings. And then comes along building performance standards. And essentially what they do is they take that energy usage data and they create energy performance targets, such as energy or greenhouse gas emission performance targets for those building owners to meet after a set period of time. So the benchmarking data gives you more information on how your building is using energy, but then the building performance standards just help drive those energy efficiency improvements in the building stock and help those buildings actually make those GHG reductions over time. As of right now, building owners do not need to take any action for the building performance standards. They will go into effect in June of 2023, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into more of the details. You can go to the next slide, Keith. And so House Bill 21-1286 also directed the state to develop these building performance standards, but told us to convene a task force of 18 members that would help the state come up with these standards. And so as you can see on this slide, we have 18 different members that represent a variety of groups. We wanted to make sure the state was getting feedback from the correct groups involved in the building stock. So we have utilities on here, we have local government officials, we have architects and engineers. We have a wide range of experience. So we want to make sure we are getting input from a wide range. This task force began meeting last October in 2021, and they meet almost monthly to help the state develop these recommendations. They're close to final on making these recommendations. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but these recommendations are due to the Energy Office, the Executive Director, and the Governor and the Air Quality Control Commission on October 1st. And so we have a few months ahead of us to make these recommendations final. You can go on to the next slide, Keith. So you may be wondering how the task force has come up with these recommendations and what guidance they had. And so our statute provided guidance to the task force to ensure that these standards are going to be equitable across the building sector and across building owners as well. So the task force considered many things, including different ways building owners can achieve greenhouse gas reductions. And a very important note about our building performance standards is that we have to differentiate between the greenhouse gas reduction of building owners, but also from the utility sector. As the grid is decarbonizing in the background, that is a separate greenhouse gas reduction than what building owners are taking. And so this was mandated in our statute. And so as the task force was considering these recommendations, they had to consider how building owners would make these reductions and to make sure that these reductions would be attributed to them and not to the utility sector. And we can answer questions about that when we get to that. The task force also considered how multiple property types would adhere to the standard. We have many different property types, including data centers and hospitals and aviation facilities, as well as how a school or a regular office would be able to meet this. And we want to also make sure that was very understandable by these building owners as well. The task force also considered whether the workforce was there to support this policy, or what certain programs could do or be created to help support the workforce and support this policy as it's enacted. The task force also considered the financial and non-financial costs of this policy, and to ensure that building owners would be able to afford this policy and be able to afford the upgrades. And they also considered the availability of current programs and technical assistance and incentives to support building owners and utilities and local governments in adhering to this policy, but also what programs could maybe be created in the future to help them comply with this policy. The task force also considered how the state and other agencies could help support this policy, and how to support compliance and think about fines and penalties, and how to incentivize building owners to comply with this policy. And then moving on to the next slide. This is kind of an overview of everything I'm talking about right now, but the task force, in order to guide their process, voted on principles to help guide them as they made these recommendations. So with every recommendation that the task force has made so far, they wanted to make sure that, the recommendations were equitable, and that they were able to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions for the sector, but also were low carbon and would help building owners achieve these reductions instead of increasing their greenhouse gas emissions. And also ensuring that there was viability for clean energy within this policy as well. Again, as I mentioned, these are the sector-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets. The building sector has to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 7% by 2026, 20% by 2030. And I'll also add here that when we are talking about covered buildings or sector-wide, what this means is all of the buildings that have to comply with the state's benchmarking program and building performance standard program. So we have a list of buildings that are 50,000 square feet or above. And so these are the buildings that we're referring to when we mean sector-wide, the ones that have to comply with this policy. And these task force recommendations also will ensure that building owners lower their energy costs and improve indoor air quality as well. And then moving on to the final slide in this section, these are just the broad principles that the task force voted on. And again, I've kind of talked to a bit of these already. And so this slide is on our website, where you can learn more about the principles that the task force voted on and what helped guide them through this process. I think we can move on to questions on the next question slide. I know we kind of, I've talked about a lot there and threw a lot of details out, but if anyone would like to ask any questions, they can unmute themselves or raise their hand via Zoom. I'll also allow Keith or anyone from Lotus if I glossed over anything or if I forgot anything to mention.
I don't think anything you forgot. Awesome, Crystal. And just, we have one question in the chat, which I can read out loud. Are there plans to implement BPS ratings that could become part of the building metadata? The rating could be a certificate, much like an MPG sticker, and would declare buildings' performance rating and would provide a comparison with other buildings and thus incentivize better performing buildings. The EU has an energy passport system that serves this purpose.
That's actually a really good question. And that is, yes, the state is hoping to do that. And as I mentioned, the benchmarking is kind of connected to this building performance standard policy. So you actually hopefully will see some of these certificates on buildings after the state finishes its first benchmarking year. And so what we will provide to building owners who have complied to our program is they will have a certificate that they can put on their window or on their entryway that will provide information on their energy usage for the year, and it will also provide information on their site UI. And so that's kind of the state's first step into enacting that. until the BPS is actually, the rules are written, which will be next June, then we can kind of think about what type of certificate we'll provide to building owners to show that they have complied with the BPS and how their building is performing in relation to other buildings. So we're taking a very simplified approach to that on the benchmarking side right now that will just show that they've complied to the state's benchmarking program and show their EUI score. But we hopefully will be doing that with the BPS side, just a little bit more details, but very good question. And I do see a question that came in. The presentation is not over. We were just pausing for questions. So we're taking any questions on the background of why the state passed this policy or why the state is enacting this policy. But I think based on our chat, I think we can move forward. Does that work for Lotus and Keith? Okay, I'm getting head nods. Okay, so moving on into a bit more detail on our recommendations. So we're going to kind of lay the groundwork for everyone on the call right now. So as we mentioned, this is a public comment period right now, but as you can see on this timeline, there are many deadlines for the building performance standard. So as I've touched on, the benchmarking program went into effect this year. And so on this timeline, the top bar, all that's referring to is the benchmarking data submission. So these building owners will be benchmarking every single year. Every June, they will have to submit benchmarking data to the state. So that's what those, that's the deadlines on the top are referring to. On the bottom, you'll see the building performance standards timelines as they are. There will be more detail added to these timelines as the recommendations are finalized. So as you can see, October 1st of this year is when these recommendations are due to the Energy Office's executive director and the governor and the Air Quality Control Commission. And then they will take that time between October 1st of 2022 and June 1st of 2023 to promulgate those rules and write the more detailed rules of the building performance standards. And then you'll see after that is enacted in June of 2023, building owners will have from then until June 1st of 2027 to show compliance with the building performance standard. And we'll go into more of the details of how they'll show compliance, of what they're adhering to. It's a metric that they will be showing. But so they'll have roughly around 3 years to comply and to but there'll also be benchmarking as well, and we'll touch on that of how they'll be able to track how they're doing with their compliance as well. So it's a broad overview of the timeline. More detail will be added to this as the recommendations are finalized. And then Keith, if you go to the next slide, as you'll see with the recommendations that we're about to go into, these recommendations are very broad. There's a lot of buildings and property types that are affected by this policy, and the state is aware of that. But essentially, the task force's role is to provide broad recommendations. And the way we refer to it is kind of like passing the baton. It's a relay. And so what the task force is doing is making these broad recommendations and then passing the baton to the Air Quality Control Commission, who will then take those proposals and write the more detailed rules. So as we go through this, please keep that in mind. There are some aspects of the building performance standard when it comes to civil penalties and things like demand flexibility and programs to support compliance that the task force is still deliberating and voting on. So those aspects will still be included in the building performance standard policy. They're just not available for the public's review right now. But once the task force does finalize the recommendations, that will be available on the Colorado Energy Office's website. I believe we've included the link in the chat, but we'll have those final recommendations included on our website for the public to view. Then Keith, if you move on to our handy dandy map that will be guiding this meeting. So we understand that this can be a little bit complicated. We call this our BPS compliance map, but we're going to break this down, and after each section, we're going to take questions because we know that there's a lot here. So what this map is showing is just the various pathways that a building owner can show compliance to the Energy Office and show that they've complied with the building performance standard. So we're going to take these in chunks. And so what we're going to focus on right now is the main compliance pathways. And we'll go into more detail, but essentially the main metric of the building performance standards will be site energy usage intensity, or site EUI. And this site EUI will become a target for each property type. And so again, we'll go into more detail. We're just broadly going over this. So with this site property or property target, site UI property target, there are two main forms of compliance. So a building owner can make energy efficiency improvements or they can electrify 80% of their building's load. And that will show, hopefully help them meet their site UI target. And so Keith, no, you're right, you can go to the next slide. So essentially, again, the metric will be property type specific. It'll be site energy usage intensity, which is essentially the energy usage of a building expressed as it's a calculation that Energy Star Portfolio Manager actually does for building owners. Calculates the energy usage in a building and divides it by its square footage. So that's simply what the site UI calculation is. And again, this was a huge conversation with the task force because they wanted to make sure it was easily understandable by any building owner. And they wanted to make sure that a building owner could easily track this. So as I mentioned with that timeline, building owners will be benchmarking every year. And so Energy Star spits out a site UI for them. And so they will, once they receive a target, they'll actually be able to track and see how close they are getting to that target via Energy Star Portfolio Manager. I should mention that tool is directed in our statute for building owners to use. So they will have to comply using that tool, but again, it is free. So going a little bit more into detail of how the state is going to calculate these targets. So these targets are not to be calculated by the task force. They simply have selected this as the metric that building owners will show to the state. And so these targets will be developed, as I said, for different property types. So offices will have a different EUI target than, say, a hospital or a data center. And these targets are going to be developed by the state, the Colorado Energy Office, in collaboration with Group 14 Engineering. They have a lot of experience with doing this. And these targets will go on to the AQCC, or the Air Quality Control Commission, and they will review these targets to make sure that they feel like they are adequate for the different property types. And an important distinction for these property targets as well is that it will be based on Colorado specific data. So it'll be using that benchmarking data to set these property targets. It will be weather normalized, and we're hoping to also make it occupancy normalized as well. And it'll again be coming from our benchmarking data, which we're currently collecting. And then moving on to how this target intersects with the main compliance pathways. And so building owners will hopefully be able to comply with the BPS through energy efficiency. That's the main form of compliance, and that is kind of the goal of a building performance standard, is to help building owners understand their usage within the building, whether that's certain systems that they can turn off while the building is unoccupied, help them change occupant behavior, and things like that. So energy efficiency should be the main form of compliance. And we provided some details here on like energy conservation measures and how they can reduce their energy waste and costs in the building. And so this should also lead to greenhouse gas reductions as well. And so as I mentioned, they will be able to track their site UI progress as they benchmark each year. And in case people in the call are not aware, with site energy usage intensity, or site UI, a lower EUI signifies that your building has good energy performance. So essentially, building owners will be lowering their site UI, hopefully through energy efficiency. And then the second form of compliance that the task force discussed was 80% electrification. And so what the task force wanted to do was to incentivize electrification in buildings, but not make it mandatory to comply with this policy. The task force was very aware that not all building owners can make these types of improvements to electrify their equipment. However, if a building owner is able to achieve the electrification of 80% of their load, of their water and space heating load, that will allow them to comply with their site UI target, full compliance with their target. And so again, this recommendation was to try to encourage building owners to electrify their equipment if they can, but it does not require them to do so. And also, as building owners switch out fossil fuel equipment with electric equipment, this should help lower their EUI. So it should help them meet their target. So these are the two main compliance pathways, and they can combine them. They can use energy efficiency and electrification. And again, it will be lowering their site UI target over time. And hopefully the target that has been set for their property type, like an office, they will then be able to meet by 2027. And so Keith, we can, I think, go to the next slide. Oh, yes. And so as I mentioned, The task force is still deliberating on the civil penalties of the building performance standard. So that is not finalized, and we don't have the final details to share with the public yet. But what the state can provide is that the statute, HB 21-1286, did provide some guidance on civil penalties for the building performance standard. So essentially, if a building owner does not comply with the building performance standard, there is a max fine of $2,000 for the first violation, and then a max fine of $5,000 for the subsequent violation. An important distinction to make when it comes to civil penalties is that public buildings are not subject to these penalties. Again, this definition has been listed in our statute and we have to adhere to it, but the state considers public buildings any covered building that is owned by a state, a local government, a special district, and a state or privately owned institute of higher education. And so you can find these details on our benchmarking website as well as our building performance standards website. But the state wants to provide some information here to let you know that there will be several civil penalties, but the goal of the building performance standard is to incentivize compliance and to provide a lot of programs and support and technical assistance to help building owners comply with this program. We don't want to go the civil penalty route. We want to collaborate with building owners and help them comply. And so I think with that, we can actually pause here for questions. I think that's the next slide. And maybe incorrect, yeah. So we kind of talked about the main compliance pathways on the left. We're going to talk about alternative compliance pathways, additional actions building owners can take to comply, but we'll pause here for any questions on the building performance standard timeline or the metric, as well as the main compliance pathways.
Yeah, great, Crystal. So we've got 3 questions in the chat, but also looks like someone raised their hand. So have a preference of which goes first?
Let's let the person who raised their hand unmute themselves. I think it's Michael Wurzel, and then we can go through the chat questions.
Great.
Michael? Michael, it seems like you're unmuted and you have your hand raised, but we can't hear you.
Perhaps while he's working on that, we can go to the first question in the chat and come back to him.
So the first question in the chat is the task force considering moving the building performance standards into the MLS, I think multiple listing service, and therefore moving BPS in the building appraisal process, again, in order to provide an additional incentive for owners to undertake the work. It places real value on the performance work.
Go ahead, Keith.
I think, at this point, the task force is really focused on trying to get the recommendations delivered by the statutory deadline that we have, and then looking at the process of moving from, then the Energy Office, of course, and others will be looking at the process of moving from those recommendations into rules. I think it's probably a bit premature to offer an opinion on sort of what might come next when we really are very much in the early stages of trying to develop the recommendations. But certainly happy to take that back for consideration. And Crystal, I don't know if you had anything to add.
No, I think that's a perfect answer. So thank you, Keith.
Michael, do we have you now?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yes.
No problem.
Okay, so my question is, given the emphasis on site EUI, we're based out of Boulder. So we've been doing compliance with their building performance ordinance now. And I think like their building performance ordinance has an acknowledgement that buildings can only get so far. And what I'm talking about is a lot of our building stock at UCAR, NCAR is like labs built in the 70s and 80s, and they're kind of energy hogs. So we've done the retro commissioning, we've done the energy efficiency, we're doing lighting now, we're doing like a ton, and we're investing a lot in our buildings, but I'm concerned that these kind of labs are not going to be able to meet certain EUI metrics.
Thank you for bringing up that concern, and it's a really good point, and that is something that our task force has deliberated and had many conversations over, and that's something that the Energy Office is also very aware of. We're not trying to make this very onerous or hard for building owners to meet, and so that actually, I know we have a few other questions that we'll take, but as we go through alternative compliance pathways and our property, our compliance adjustment options, we'll actually be able to touch on that, of how we understand that not all buildings may be able to meet an average site UI for a property type, but they will be able to take additional actions as well as be able to adjust their target if they can show the state that they made a good faith effort. So that I hope you know that is something that the task force has deliberated on. And we'll definitely provide some more information at the end. And so if you have more questions when we get to that, please ask us then as well. And Kim, did you say we have more comments in the chat?
We do. And Michael, did you have a follow-up thought on that? I saw your hand go back up.
It's actually a separate question.
Okay.
Sure.
I guess looking at the compliance pathways of like 80% of load versus electrification, I was just curious, like a lot of times the electrification of the appliances is actually going to be less energy efficient than natural gas. So I'm curious that if you move toward the electrification and it actually increases your EUI, is the EUI the standard, or is meeting the 80% electrification the standard?
That is a very good question. And that's something else that the task force thought about. There's a lot of the research out there does point to that electrification should lower EUI. But again, that's why I want to make sure that there's considerations. So the target that they would have to meet or be granted compliance with is the site UI target that they're given. So the 80% electrification hopefully will allow them to meet that target. And again, it's a very broad proposal. So the types of documentation that the state would need to verify, all of that has not been decided. That is up to the AQCC. So that's actually a very good point, and we'll touch on this later, but we do have a survey that's open. So if you haven't taken it already, please take the state's survey and provide that feedback there so that we can capture it and give that to the task force for them to consider. Thank you, Michael. And then Kim.
And then Chris, we have just two more questions.
Okay.
So the next question is indoor air quality one of the BPS metrics, something like the daily, monthly, and seasonal red, green, yellow averages with the ability to drill down into daily, hourly data if desired?
So indoor air quality is not one of the BPS metrics. And I'll let Keith add to this if I'm missing anything, but we wanted, again, to reiterate, we wanted this to be very easily understandable by building owners. So we wanted them to be able to see this through their energy data, and the indoor air quality would be a little bit harder for them to track. And so site EUI is the main metric of the BPS. The task force did consider other metrics like source EUI, as well as Energy Star score, and as well as greenhouse gas intensity as well. So indoor air quality will not be one of the metrics. That is something that the state, the Energy Office, and other agencies track for the state. But I also wanted to backtrack a little bit for the background. I realized I said that the site UI metric is what the building owners are tracking. I wanted to emphasize that those greenhouse gas reduction targets of 7% and 20%, that will be up to the state. The state and other state agencies like our Clean Air Division will be tracking that for the building sector itself. So the building owners only have to worry about their site EUI and meeting their target. The state will kind of take that burden of making sure that the building stock is meeting those sector targets. So just providing a little bit background there.
And if I may just add on to that, Crystal, it's always worth reminding folks that 7% and that 20% target apply to the covered building sector as a whole and not to individual buildings. And so again, in order to make it simpler for building owners to comply, it really is focused on that site EUI or that 80% of electrification, and the pathways we've yet to talk about, but we'll get to. And as Crystal correctly pointed out, the state agencies will be looking at the sector as a whole and whether what's being done in the sector is meeting that sector-wide target.
Thank you, Keith.
Great. So a couple more came into the chat, but first, is the subsequent violation applied yearly or in 2026 and in 2030? And this is in regards to the civil penalties.
Yeah. So do you want me to take that, Crystal, or
sure.
Would you? So that's an excellent question. And we and the task force recognize that the statute is not entirely clear on when or how to calculate a first, a second, or a subsequent violation. And so I think as the slide reflected earlier, the task force is still looking at what recommendation to bring forward to the division and to the Air Commission on how to interpret the statute. So the straight answer to the question is the task force has yet to develop a recommendation on how that should be interpreted. And as we get to that October deadline, I think that is one of the things that they will clearly have a recommendation on, but we just haven't gotten there yet.
Great, thank you, Keith. What is the role of this task force once the recommendations are presented to the AQCC?
That is a very good question. And actually, Keith works at the AQCC way more than I do. So I'll let Keith actually answer that question. And I'll say that it's a two-parter. It's what is the task force role once the recommendations are presented to the AQCC, but then what is the long-term role of the AQCC after rulemaking?
Yeah, and that is a good question. The way we understand the statute is that the task of the task force is to deliver a set of recommendations to the director of the Energy Office and to the governor, and that those will be brought forward as the foundation for a rulemaking that will establish the building performance standards for the state of Colorado. At that point, the task force will have completed its mission and satisfied its objective. And so we don't anticipate a role for the task force as the task force in that rulemaking process.
And I think that actually may be the last of the questions. So I'm actually going to pass the baton to you, Keith, to actually talk about alternative compliance pathways.
And quickly, just to make sure we covered the second part of that question, I just want to make sure we touch on the long-term role of the AQCC after the rulemaking.
So I think to maybe step outside that question for a minute, there will be a role for the division at the AQCC in terms of as Crystal said, tracking that compliance with the 7 and the 20% targets. There is a unit there that is doing the work of tracking each of the different sectors and where they are in terms of emissions reductions. And so they will take on that role. I think right now we don't contemplate, nor do we direct the work of the Air Quality Control Commission. So, pursuant to statute, we will deliver the recommendations to the division and they will develop the rules. I think what happens subsequent to the initial rulemaking is in part up to the Air Commission and the direction that they want to take things.
Great.
Thank you for reminding me to answer the second half of that question.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. So as I think Crystal said earlier, we have intended this to be a roadmap that helps guide our conversation through the different pathways that building owners can use to comply with the building performance standards. And she did an excellent job walking through the primary pathways. But as you can see from the map, those two green boxes lead either to a site EUI being met or a site EUI not being met. And so the first place I'm going to take us is into that blue box on the upper right-hand side that talks about different alternative compliance pathways that a building owner can take in order to help achieve the site EUI. And so what we have tried to do as a task force is to build in different types of flexibility that would help enable compliance with the building performance standards. And so that upper blue box contemplates either a building owner not being able to do 80% electrification or a building owner who has done as much energy efficiency as they might be able to do in a cost-effective way or that the building might allow, but still hasn't met that site EUI. And so I'm going to walk through the way the task force has contemplated using renewables, partial electrification, and then demand flexibility or demand response. And I will note at the outset that that's still something that's not quite resolved by the task force. Again, renewable energy as a compliance mechanism is really additive to those primary pathways. And the renewable energy that's being contemplated is renewable energy that's identified in different state statutes: wind, solar, geothermal, biogas, in-stream flow, hydroelectric facilities. I will say about the solar that, pursuant to changes in statute in the last few years, that solar can either be installed on a building owner's actual building property, can be installed on the building itself, or could be installed offsite in land that the building owner controls. And so it, again, provides some amount of flexibility where a building owner may have, non-contiguous properties, one of which is suitable for solar development. That building owner could use that land now, and the generation from the solar resources could count towards compliance with the overall BPS. The task force recommended that the Air Commission credit renewable generation based on avoided utilities emissions, and that the building owner retain the renewable energy credits or RECs. And so I want to take a moment just to explain a little bit what each of those two criteria mean. On the first of those, the utility avoided emissions, what we know based on other statutes and changes is that the grid in Colorado is moving from a fossil-based coal and gas grid to a largely renewable grid. Right now, the 6 utilities that control more than 90% of the fossil generation in the state have plans that demonstrate that they will get to an roughly an 86% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030, and get somewhere around an 80 to an 85% renewable grid in that same 2030 timeframe. And so what this first recommendation here, or criteria in the recommendation, says is that as you have renewable energy, the value of that renewable energy essentially will be a little bit less over time, because you're basically displacing fewer and fewer emissions as the grid itself gets greener. So in part, this creates an incentive for building owners to develop renewable energy projects early, where it can help with those early year compliance requirements and reduce emissions. It also requires that building owners retain the renewable energy credits or RECs. And this is really to avoid double counting of emissions reductions. Right now, the way that we have looked at as a state handling renewable energy on customer sited properties or offsite that would count towards customer properties is that the building itself or the owner of the building has to retain those RECs. If they don't, then those avoided emissions really are the property of the utility, essentially, for accounting purposes. And so we want to make sure we know who gets to claim those avoided emissions reductions. We are aware as an office and as a task force that there are a lot of questions about how to handle historic energy systems, solar in particular, that building owners have acquired prior to the passage of the benchmarking and the BPS standards. And we are certainly looking at that and trying to come up with a way that it is fair and equitable to building owners who have made those early investments. Right now, I think that the task force doesn't have a firm recommendation on those historic systems, but I think that's still a conversation that we have going forward, and certainly something that I think we can anticipate that the Air Commission will address as it looks at developing rules for those systems. So this just goes into more detail about what I have already talked about, but we wanted to make sure it was here as a reference slide for folks who are coming back to this or who are sharing it with colleagues in the industry. So, sure, captured all that. Okay. Partial electrification. Again, 80% electrification or electrification of 80% of load is a primary compliance pathway, but we also recognize that a lot of building owners may not be able to get there. And the task force wanted to ensure that there was an opportunity to couple electrification with that primary energy efficiency pathway, and to give building owners that opportunity to do the energy efficiency investments first, but realize that they may be able to electrify water heating but not space heating, or they may be able to electrify space heating but not water heating. And so building owners can receive partial credit based on the share of space or water heating and the load that represents to us. And so as we go forward, there will need to be a demonstration by building owners of what appliances were moved from a fossil gas-based source to an electric source, as well as the changes in energy. And we will work with them to understand the representative emissions changes that would result from that shift from fossil gas to electrification. Again, we want to make this a pathway that building owners can use, and we as the Energy Office can help with the resources to really handle that emissions set of calculations with them and the building performance standard team. So I think, Crystal, did we want to stop here for questions before we go on to alternative compliance, or should I dive into alternative compliance next?
Let's actually take a break here. We have a few questions around clarifications, or just some general questions for you around the section. A quick clarifying question is, for the renewable systems that are in service by 2023, where we specified that they did not need to retain a REC, is it only older renewable systems that are eligible for that consideration?
So again, to be clear, these are recommendations that the task force is making to the Air Commission. And so, I think we have not fully interpreted exactly what that would mean, but we are working to try and structure a recommendation to create that time fence for systems. And so, I guess the task force hasn't yet gotten to a place where they have a recommendation on exactly when in day, date, and month to draw that time fence in 2023. I think what we would do as the Energy Office when we look at compliance with the BPS is really try to be flexible with building owners and try and give them a compliance pathway. I also think that, building owners are on notice that this is going to be something that as a recommendation we're bringing forward. And certainly, the commission, as it takes hold and crafts the rules, will ultimately develop a firm compliance pathway for building owners with respect to the date and time. So I recognize that that's perhaps something of a not quite comfortable answer, but I always want to be careful with the folks on this call to help understand that we are making with the task force a set of recommendations that will result in rules. And so the recommendations, I think, again, will try and provide that flexibility and that opportunity for building owners to comply as we go forward. And Crystal, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that. Please do.
No, I think you touched on everything. These are broad recommendations. The AQCC will be able to provide more of that detail, and the Energy Office can try to help with that. Also, to add on to that, of if there is any feedback on where that time fence should be drawn or something like that, that again is something that you can provide to the Energy Office in that survey. So please provide all your feedback there. And then moving on. Actually, there's another question, but this one's related to the fractional credit. So this person said that it sounds as though the fractional credit is expected to be reduced for the renewables over time based on emissions from grid electricity. Is that accurate? And Keith,
that is accurate. That is the recommendation that the task force has made. And again, that's to reflect the fact that the emissions that are being avoided by that renewable energy system really are decreasing over time as the underlying system energy or the grid relies less on fossil gas and coal and more on wind, solar, and other renewables.
Thank you for asking that question too, because that provides the state some feedback as well as the task force on perhaps that's some wording that we need to add into the recommendation to make them as clear as possible to the AQCC. Asking a little bit more of a broad question, but a very good question, is that with the BPS that Colorado is looking to adopt, is it consistent with national or international standards? I've heard the complaint that we're trying to write our own rules, which makes compliance difficult. And some background I can provide on this is that, and Lotus can actually provide some information here too, is that the Lotus team and the Energy Office team, we've actually collaborated with other cities and states and asked their feedback on their process. But we've looked to what has happened with building performance standards across the nation. So we have done our research on this. And we also have worked with the Department of Energy as well as the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, on our standards as well. We've asked their feedback and their input to ensure that Colorado is making the best decisions possible. And I should say the task force is making the best decisions possible. We've also worked with the Institute for Market Transformation, IMT, as well as the National Buildings Institute as well. And so they've all provided us feedback and provided us background on these policies across the nation. I will say that when it comes to Colorado, it's a very different environment than other states or cities. So the task force felt very strongly about making sure this building performance standard is right for the state, including all of our utilities and all the different property types we have. That is going to be different than what another state has. So that's why we wanted to make sure our targets were set based on Colorado data. And into the person's comment about that, each state and state kind of has their own BPS rules. EPA and the Department of Energy are also aware of that. So the Colorado has provided feedback to them on this process and lessons learned. And we are working with other cities and states to, help this process in other areas as well. So that is my answer to that question. I know it's probably a little bit all over the place. Kim, did you want to provide any feedback, Kim or Keith?
I think I might just add that there is no national benchmarking standard. And so all of the benchmarking laws that we've seen in place are at a city or at a state level. And so looking at alignment where possible, but also making sure that there's Colorado specific criteria embedded in ours. And so that, basically back to what Crystal said, but there is no national or international building performance standard for us to reference here.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would do, Crystal, is to highlight 2 points that you made. One is that, the intent here is to develop a building performance standard that is based on Colorado data, based on Colorado's different, climate zones and the challenges of building at altitude, and recognizing some of the uniquenesses of California with respect to other jurisdictions, but then also making clear that we are talking to and trying to work with and share information with those other jurisdictions that are developing building performance standards so that we can try and learn from what they are doing and their best practices as well. So I would just highlight those 2 points of what you already said.
Thank you both for adding to that. A quick question that just a quick question that we'll answer is, how is the 80% electrification calculated? Is it through electric kBTU or total kBTU? And it goes into a little bit more detail, but I know it's maybe a frustrating answer, but unfortunately, again, this will be up to the Air Quality Control Commission. The task force has just simply made that recommendation that this should be a primary form of compliance. So those details will be up to the AQCC. But if you have any experience in calculating that or any feedback you'd like to provide the state, please put that again in the survey. And then I think this may be our final question for this section. So if one of the goals of the state's BPS is reducing greenhouse gas emissions through lowering EUI, doesn't the demand side management, smart load balancing, make sense as a metric? Avoided demand uses the cheapest kilowatt hours. Keith, do you want to talk a little bit more about that, or how the task force did consider that?
Yeah, and again, when you think about energy efficiency, we have that as that primary pathway. So the question is really what to do with demand response and demand flexibility. And the task force continues to look at the idea of how to credit demand response towards the overall site EUI, or how to look at demand flexibility, shifting load from 1 hour of the day to another hour of the day, where it might be from an hour that has higher emissions to lower emissions. And, we as the Energy Office, independent of the work that we are doing on the task force, continue to look at this as well. I think that the task force is going to see from the Energy Office some thoughts on the role for demand response as a possible partial compliance pathway based on the ability to avoid energy. And so there is a lot more work that the task force still has to do on that final recommendation on demand response and demand flexibility. And we're hoping to get to a place where they will have a recommendation as the full set of recommendations comes forward and then goes to the Air Commission. Appreciate the question.
And that's actually all the questions we have right now. I think you can move on to the next section, Keith.
Great. So I'm going to skip through these since we've talked through them. And I want to talk now about this orange box at the bottom, which are compliance adjustment options. I want to come back to something I said earlier as we talked about the alternative compliance pathways and this map, and that is that the goal was really to build in flexibility. I think the task force, again, recognized that electrification and energy efficiency may not be enough for building owners, and that's why we have that alternative compliance pathway. But then also recognize that even those alternatives may not work for some buildings and for some building owners, and wanted to build in yet one more pathway for building owners that would help them meet those overall targets and help the sector as a whole continue to meet those targets. And so I'm going to talk now about both the compliance adjustment options, both the target and the timeline adjustment options. As you see, thinking about this as sort of, day one, what a building owner can do, they can go the electrification pathway, they can go the energy efficiency pathway, but they may also decide that the compliance adjustment pathway is their best first step. And so I want to talk about why that might be the case and which of those adjustments may make sense for a building owner, even in that initial round of compliance. So this just lays out a little bit of what I've already said about sort of the case for why the task force thinks it's important to have those compliance adjustment options and those alternatives built in here. I do want to highlight for a moment that a building owner could request both compliance adjustment options. That is a change to target and a change to timeline. But also that approval of any request to change a target or a timeline needs to come with a clear demonstration of need for the requested adjustments and supporting documentation for that. And to be clear that there's not a guarantee that those requested adjustments will be granted. That's subject to the BPS team here at the Energy Office agreeing with the assessment of the building owners that one or both of the compliance adjustment options would be warranted. It's also worth noting, and it's here in bold, that a change in timeline or target does not exempt a covered building owner from eventually complying with the BPS. So the first adjustment to talk through is really the adjustment to a change in timeline, and that's available for either the 26 compliance year or the 2030 compliance deadline. And the task force is recommending that the Air Commission develop adjustment options that would enable building owners to request those changes to timeline. It does talk here about sort of different reasons that a building owner may seek those changes to timeline. And so I don't want to walk through all of the examples that we have here, but want to highlight that that's not a list that the task force intends to be exhaustive. It's really intended to help provide some illustration and some guidance as the rules are being crafted for the kinds of things that could support a request for a change to the compliance deadline for a building owner. And just one example that I'll pick from that list would be needing to align with capital investment cycle for a building. It may well be that the capital investment cycle for a building would make it possible to achieve compliance in 2027, but not 2026. And so that's something where a building owner could then, if this became part of a final rule, submit that request to change the year from 26 to 7, and again, demonstrating that they have a capital plan that shows that investment in that timeline. That would be the kind of documentation that I think we would expect to see. And then the other change would be an adjustment in target. And again, as Crystal said, the initial year is 2021. So we will be using that 2021 data, but the task force felt that there needed to be an option for building owners to request an adjustment to their site EUI target. And I think this goes to the first set of questions that we had around, that Michael was asking around the UCAR NCAR buildings, and the fact that, a building may have done as much as it possibly could, and it's still struggling just based on the design and the potential of the building to hit that site EUI target. Again, assuming that they've taken that renewable route and done those other things, or that those may not be possible for them, that type of building could then request a change to target. And I think that goes to the first example that's here on the list of sort of the inherent unique characteristics and operating requirements of the particular building type. So again, the task force is making that recommendation to the Air Commission to adopt this type of compliance adjustment option, trying to provide some illustrative examples that would help guide the development of a rule. And again, there is that requirement for documentation to support the request for a change to a target, a site EUI target for a building. So those are the two changes that we have for compliance options. The last set of things that we were going to talk through was current programs to assist building owners in complying with the BPS. But Crystal, did we want to stop here and talk about those two alternatives and then move forward with the...
Yeah, I think we can actually ask, we have no questions in the chat so far. So does anyone have any questions about those flexible compliance adjustment options? If not, the state can move on to these other programs. Okay, Keith, I think you can move on.
Great. So we've been asked in different conversations around what resources does the state of Colorado have to help building owners meet the state's building performance standards. And so within the Energy Office, we have a building finance and innovation team that helps run a number of different programs that have worked with building owners to help them through the years improve energy efficiency. And so one of those is the CPACE, or Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing Program, which is a tool that allows commercial and multifamily property owners to finance different kinds of efficiency, renewable energy, and conservation efforts. And so Michael Turner and his team here will certainly be happy to work with folks on this call, as well as other building owners. And, it is free to talk to us to help work through the process of developing a PACE application, and, happy to connect you with the team that actually does all of that work here. So we just wanted to highlight this opportunity. If there are questions, around sort of the requirements to apply, we're happy to follow up with folks individually on those details as we go forward. A separate pathway that we house within the Energy Office is energy performance contracting. And, it allows public jurisdictions to use utility savings or savings in utility bills to help finance the cost of energy efficiency upgrades. And so, again, that's a program within the Energy Office that we can help direct you to the right folks as we go forward. But really, I think one of the things to highlight here is that the way the EPC program is set up and the way the engineers within the EPC program work with building owners, there's a guarantee of energy savings costs and maintenance savings costs over time. So that's sort of built into the process of developing an energy performance contract. I also wanted to highlight two additional things. One, in Colorado, we have a green bank here, the Colorado Clean Energy Fund, and CCEF provides a lot of opportunity to work with building owners on creative finance solutions for energy efficiency and renewable energy upgrades. If you're interested in more information on that, reach out to Crystal or me, and we can connect you with Paul Scharfenberger and the team at CCEF to figure out if there are financing packages that would help here. And then the last thing is legislation that was passed recently, House Bill 1362, which made changes actually implemented an energy efficiency building code. And it really put in place a statewide minimum performance requirement for buildings as part of building codes. And the way this is intended to work is as jurisdictions update their building codes, they will adopt the updated energy code as well, which is listed here as that 2021 IECC code. And we anticipate that would, for most jurisdictions, be in that window of 2023 to 2026. And as part of that update, they would include the appendices to the IECC for electricity and solar ready provisions. Those provisions will be developed by the Energy Code Board. So again, part of that legislation is a requirement that the Energy Office stand up an Energy Code Board, which has a broad range of stakeholders as part of that. Where this intersects with the work of the building performance standard is that as these codes come online and as buildings are built to these codes, we anticipate that those buildings, by being in compliance with the codes, will also be in compliance with the BPS, and that no further action would be required. And so that's, going to depend in part on sort of the analysis, but that's certainly what we've been led to expect based on our conversations with code experts and others around the country. Crystal, I don't know if you've got anything to add on any of these, but I think that was our final slide in this section, and we're going to go to questions now. So before we jump to questions, I'll let you jump in and correct anything I've said or make additions.
No, that was all correct. I think we're ready for questions. I may have you just go to the next slide on the survey. I think we have it open.
Yep, I will pop that up there now, and happy to take questions on any of this from folks on the call.
And feel free to just put your question in the chat or to raise your hand and we'll call on you.
While we're waiting for that, did we have something?
No, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say that, we have one more public engagement meeting on July 20th from 3 to 5. For those on the call, that's not going to be new material. We are likely to go over the same set of slides. The purpose of having 3 different public engagement meetings was really to make sure that we were giving ample opportunity for folks to hear from us, as well as to ask us questions. And so we're not intending to provide new information, really to walk through the slides that we went through with you today. If there are no questions, I would just encourage you, please take that survey. If you do have questions afterwards, reach out to Crystal or to me. We're happy to follow up with you in response to those. And I also want to thank you for taking the time to engage with us and for the great questions that were asked. Appreciate that.
And thank you everyone for joining and participating in the call. We'll post our contact information in the chat again, just in case you didn't get it earlier, but we'll just wait a few minutes in case anyone else has any questions, or we'll just end the call. Thank you again for joining.
And Crystal, as we're winding down, I'm not sure, Kimberly or Claire, if one of you was popping the email addresses into the chat, but I did want to note that I have a non-standard state email address because we had to use my middle initial. So if we do that this time, it would be keith.m.hay@state.co.us. So.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. We made that edit and it should be the correct email address in the chat.
Perfect. And I wish I didn't have a non-standard one, but that was outside my control.
I'll also just flag too, I think Keith may have actually already said that, but the survey is open until next Friday, which is July 22nd. So we wanted to give the public a chance to attend these meetings, and based on what we said today, that if you want to provide feedback, that survey is going to be open until next Friday, and we're just really thankful for all the public's feedback on this. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.